Eleanor Chen said warmly to the visiting Russian cultural delegation, her flawless Moscow accent filling St. Matthew's Episcopal Church with perfect Russian that stunned the congregation into silence. The three diplomats' faces lit up with surprise and relief as Eleanor continued the conversation with sophisticated vocabulary and cultural nuances that seemed impossible for a small-town church organist. She continued, discussing Orthodox theology and Russian musical traditions with knowledge that impressed even the visiting cultural attaché from the Russian consulate. What the congregation and visitors didn't know was that the woman graciously welcoming Russian guests while seated at her church organ was formerly Elena Volkov, CIA intelligence operative, who had spent 25 years conducting classified operations inside the Soviet Union during the Cold War's most dangerous decades, using linguistic skills that had once meant the difference between mission success and potentially fatal exposure. Eleanor Chen, 67 years old, had been serving as organist and music director at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in the small Virginia town of Millbrook for 8 years, maintaining the same methodical professionalism that had characterized her 25-year career with the Central Intelligence Agency. Every Sunday at 8:30 a.m., she arrived wearing conservative church attire, carrying sheet music and hymnal selections that she had chosen to complement the day's liturgical readings and seasonal themes. The congregation knew Eleanor as the accomplished musician who had transformed their church's music program from basic hymn singing into sophisticated worship that included classical compositions, contemporary arrangements, and multicultural selections that reflected the diversity of their community. She had rebuilt the choir program, organized musical events that brought the community together, and created an atmosphere of worship that enhanced the spiritual life of everyone at St. Matthew's. What parishioners didn't notice was Eleanor's automatic linguistic assessment when new visitors attended services, the way she recognized foreign accents and cultural backgrounds, the way she organized her music library with systematic precision that suggested training beyond typical musical education. Her approach to church music was thorough and analytical in ways that reflected skills developed in much more complex contexts. Eleanor had chosen church music specifically because it allowed her to use linguistic and cultural knowledge in ways that brought people together rather than divided them, after 25 years of intelligence work that had required her to navigate the dangerous political and cultural tensions of the Cold War era. Her CIA career had begun in 1978 when the agency recruited her from Columbia University, where she was completing a doctoral dissertation in Russian literature while also studying advanced linguistics, Soviet history, and Eastern European cultural studies. The combination of language aptitude, cultural knowledge, and psychological profiles suitable for intelligence work had made her an ideal candidate for CIA operations targeting the Soviet Union. Eleanor's training had been extensive and sophisticated. Months at CIA facilities learning everything from advanced surveillance techniques to cultural immersion that allowed her to pass as a native Russian speaker. Specialized instruction in Soviet political systems, cultural protocols, and social dynamics that would allow her to operate effectively within Russian society. Cover identity construction, operational security procedures, and psychological preparation for living deep cover identities that could last for years. Her first assignment had been a 2-year posting to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, operating under diplomatic cover while gathering intelligence on Soviet scientific and technological developments. But her language skills and cultural knowledge had quickly identified her as valuable for more sophisticated operations that required deeper penetration of Soviet society. Eleanor's subsequent assignments had taken her throughout the Soviet sphere of influence, 3 years in East Berlin posing as a German translator for international academic conferences, 18 months in Prague working as a cultural attaché while monitoring Warsaw Pact military activities, and multiple shorter operations throughout Eastern Europe where her linguistic abilities allowed her to gather intelligence that was impossible to obtain through technical means. But Eleanor's most significant work had been her final assignment, 5 years operating under non-official cover in Moscow as Elena Volkov, a Soviet citizen who had supposedly returned to Russia after growing up in a Russian emigre community in Canada. The deep cover assignment had required her to completely assume a Russian identity, live as a Soviet citizen, and gather intelligence on political and military developments while maintaining a false identity that could withstand scrutiny from the KGB. The psychological toll of maintaining false identities for years at a time, of forming relationships based on deception, and of constantly assessing everyone around her as potential threats or intelligence sources had eventually become overwhelming. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, Eleanor had requested retirement from operational assignments. "I want to use my linguistic skills and cultural knowledge to bring people together rather than gather intelligence about them," she had told her CIA debriefers during her transition process. Eleanor's choice of church music as her post-CIA career had been deliberate and meaningful. The universal language of music allowed her to serve her community while using the cultural knowledge and linguistic skills she had developed during her intelligence career for peaceful purposes that enhance worship and spiritual life. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church served a diverse community of approximately 300 active members in Millbrook, a town 30 miles west of Washington, D.C., that attracted residents who worked in various government agencies, academic institutions, and private sector organizations throughout the region. Eleanor's music program had become known for incorporating multicultural elements that reflected the international backgrounds of many parishioners. During her 8 years at St. Matthew's, Eleanor had developed strong relationships with congregation members, understanding their musical preferences, cultural backgrounds, and spiritual needs in ways that allowed her to create worship experiences that were meaningful for people from many different traditions. Eleanor, said church member Dr. James Patterson after a Sunday service that had included Russian Orthodox chants alongside traditional Episcopal hymns, "Your knowledge of different musical traditions is remarkable. Where did you learn so much about international sacred music?" "Graduate studies in comparative religion and cultural anthropology," Eleanor replied, which was technically accurate while revealing nothing about the operational context in which she had gained her cultural expertise. The morning when Eleanor's background was revealed began with an unexpected visit that demonstrated how her CIA training remained relevant even in civilian church life. 3 members of a Russian cultural delegation visiting Washington, D.C., had requested permission to observe an Episcopal service as part of their study of American religious traditions. Father Michael Thompson, St. Matthew's rector, had welcomed the visitors and asked Eleanor to provide any cultural context that might help the Russian delegation understand Episcopal worship practices. Eleanor had agreed to assist, assuming that her graduate studies in Russian culture would be sufficient for basic cultural interpretation. But when the delegation arrived and Father Thompson introduced them to Eleanor, the conversation immediately revealed the extent of Eleanor's Russian language capabilities. Father Thompson began awkwardly in heavily accented Russian that clearly demonstrated limited language study. Eleanor stepped forward and continued the introduction in flawless Russian. The effect on both the Russian delegation and the St. Matthew's congregation was immediate and profound. Eleanor's Russian was not just fluent, it was native level, with perfect Moscow pronunciation, sophisticated vocabulary, and cultural nuances that impressed even the delegation members. Dr. Alexei Petrov, the delegation's cultural attaché, responded with obvious surprise. Eleanor found herself in a situation that required careful navigation. Her Russian language skills were far beyond what graduate cultural studies would explain, but revealing her CIA background in a church setting with foreign visitors present created potential complications. Eleanor replied carefully, explaining that she had studied Russian literature and culture extensively without mentioning the operational context of that study. The conversation continued for 30 minutes, with Eleanor discussing Orthodox theology, Russian musical traditions, and comparative religious practices with knowledge that demonstrated not just academic study, but deep cultural immersion that impressed the Russian delegation, said Dr. Petrov. Eleanor paused before answering Dr. Petrov's question about whether she had lived in Russia. The truthful answer was yes. She had lived in Moscow for 5 years under deep cover, but explaining that would require revealing her intelligence background in a context that could create diplomatic complications. Eleanor replied, explaining that she had spent time in Russia through cultural and academic exchanges, which was technically accurate while omitting the intelligence context. The congregation, meanwhile, was listening to a conversation that demonstrated Eleanor possessed language skills and cultural knowledge far beyond what anyone had realized during her 8 years at St. Matthews. After the Russian delegation's visit concluded, congregation members approached Eleanor with questions about her language abilities and cultural expertise. "Eleanor," said church member Dr. Sarah Martinez, "your Russian is absolutely perfect. That level of fluency requires much more than academic study. Where did you really learn to speak Russian like a native?" Eleanor faced the same challenge she had encountered with the Russian delegation: how to explain linguistic skills that clearly indicated extensive experience beyond academic training. Dr. Martinez, "I had opportunities for intensive language study and cultural immersion during my graduate work and early career. Russian language and culture have been lifelong interests." But Dr. Martinez, who was herself a linguist and language professor, recognized that Eleanor's Russian demonstrated training and experience that went far beyond typical academic or cultural programs. "Eleanor, I teach linguistics and second language acquisition. What I heard today was native-level Russian with cultural sophistication that suggests years of immersion in Russian society. That's not something you get from university programs or cultural exchanges." The conversation that followed led to Eleanor acknowledging her intelligence background, though she remained circumspect about operational details that remained classified even decades after the end of the Cold War. Dr. Martinez, "I worked for the government for 25 years in positions that required extensive Russian language capabilities and cultural knowledge. I chose church music as my second career because I wanted to use my linguistic and cultural skills for peaceful purposes." Dr. Martinez understood immediately. "Eleanor, you were CIA, weren't you?" "I was a government employee who specialized in Russian affairs during the Cold War period. Now I'm a church organist who happens to speak Russian." Word of Eleanor's linguistic demonstration and government background spread quickly through the St. Matthews congregation, leading to conversations about how her experience could benefit the church's multicultural outreach and international visitor programs. Father Thompson approached Eleanor the following week with a proposal that would use her cultural expertise to enhance the church's ministry to international visitors and diverse community members. "Eleanor, your linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge could be invaluable for our interfaith dialogue programs and international outreach efforts. Would you consider developing cultural education programs that help our congregation understand and welcome visitors from different cultural backgrounds?" Eleanor accepted the expanded role, which allowed her to use her CIA cultural training to enhance religious education and multicultural ministry at St. Matthews. Her programs taught congregation members about different religious traditions, cultural protocols, and linguistic considerations that helped them welcome and serve visitors from many different backgrounds. "The key," Eleanor explained to congregation members during one of her cultural education sessions, "is understanding that cultural differences are opportunities for learning and connection rather than barriers to communication. When we approach other cultures with respect and genuine interest, we often discover shared values and spiritual connections." Eleanor's cultural education programs at St. Matthews led to partnerships with other religious communities, interfaith dialogue events, and multicultural worship services that enriched the spiritual life of the entire congregation. But Eleanor's linguistic skills also attracted attention from other organizations that needed cultural expertise for peaceful purposes. 6 months after the Russian delegation visit, Eleanor was approached by the Smithsonian Institution about consulting on a Cold War history exhibition that required accuracy in depicting Soviet-era cultural and social conditions. "Ms. Chen," said Smithsonian curator Dr. Robert Wilson, "we understand you have extensive knowledge of Soviet culture and society. Would you be willing to consult on historical accuracy for our Cold War exhibition?" Eleanor agreed to provide consulting services while continuing her work at St. Matthews. The combination allowed her to use her CIA cultural expertise to contribute to historical education while maintaining her commitment to church music and ministry. Eleanor's work with the Smithsonian led to additional opportunities for using her knowledge of Soviet history and culture for educational purposes. She began guest lecturing at universities, consulting with documentary filmmakers, and contributing to academic research about Cold War-era Soviet society. The goal, Eleanor explained to university students during one of her guest lectures, is to understand Soviet culture and society not as propaganda or political systems, but as human experiences that shape the lives of millions of people. Historical understanding requires cultural empathy even when studying societies we oppose politically. A year after the Russian delegation visit, Eleanor had become a recognized expert on Soviet culture and was regularly invited to speak at academic conferences and cultural institutions about Cold War history and Russian cultural traditions. Her presentation at the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies focused on the importance of cultural understanding in international relations. Linguistic and cultural knowledge aren't just tools for intelligence gathering. They're essential for building bridges between societies that have different political systems but share common human experiences. But Eleanor's primary focus remained St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where she continued serving as organist and music director while also coordinating international outreach and cultural education programs. Eleanor, said longtime parishioner Margaret Williams during one of their regular conversations, I had no idea about your government background when you first started here, but looking back, I can see that you always brought special understanding to our international visitors and multicultural programs. Eleanor realized that Margaret was right. Her CIA training in cultural analysis and linguistic communication had been evident in her church work even when congregation members didn't recognize the source of her expertise. Margaret, I think my previous work taught me that people from different cultures often share more similarities than differences, especially when it comes to spiritual needs and values. That understanding has been helpful for church ministry. 2 years after the incident that revealed her background, Eleanor received recognition from both the Episcopal Church Diocese and the American Association of Intelligence Veterans for developing interfaith dialogue programs that have become models for other religious communities. Her story was featured in church publications as an example of how specialized professional skills could be applied to religious ministry and community service, inspiring other former government employees to consider how their expertise could benefit religious and community organizations. Today, Eleanor Chen continues serving as organist and music director at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, while also directing the congregation's international ministry program. She still arrives every Sunday at 8:30 a.m., still chooses music that enhances worship, and still creates musical experiences that bring the community together in spiritual fellowship. But she also provides cultural consultation for religious organizations, lectures at universities about Soviet history and culture, and mentors other former intelligence professionals who are transitioning to careers in education, ministry, or cultural institutions. The church organ where Eleanor plays hymns and coordinates international cultural exchanges displays a small brass plaque that reads, "In appreciation of musical ministry that transcends cultural boundaries." Eleanor requested that the recognition focus on ministry rather than individual service. Eleanor's story reminds us that intelligence expertise doesn't diminish when applied to peaceful purposes. It transforms. That CIA cultural training can enhance religious ministry just as effectively as it gathered intelligence. That the same linguistic skills used to operate in foreign societies can be used to welcome foreign visitors and build cultural understanding. The next time you attend religious services, remember Eleanor Chen. Remember that the organist playing hymns might have cultural experience gained in situations and places you can't imagine. Remember that they might have chosen religious ministry not because they lack other qualifications, but because they found meaningful ways to apply extraordinary cultural knowledge to serve spiritual communities. Sometimes the most important cultural work happens not in intelligence operations or diplomatic missions, but in churches where former CIA officers choose to use their expertise to enhance worship, welcome international visitors, and build bridges between different cultural and religious traditions. Sometimes the greatest linguistic expertise belongs to people playing organs rather than conducting operations, people who've chosen to apply intelligence training to religious ministry, ensuring that the skills developed for understanding foreign societies can be used to enhance spiritual fellowship and international understanding. We need to recognize and appreciate the skilled cultural professionals among us who've chosen to serve quietly, especially those whose previous service required working in dangerous places and complex political situations, so that ordinary people could worship peacefully and welcome visitors from around the world. Because true cultural expertise doesn't disappear when careers change. It just finds new applications. And sometimes the most valuable intelligence training involves not gathering information about other cultures, but using cultural knowledge to enhance religious ministry, promote international understanding, and ensure that the linguistic precision developed for intelligence operations can be used to build spiritual communities that transcend cultural boundaries.